Ada Prescott buried her husband with $2 in her pocket, a busted wagon wheel, and a grief so heavy it bent her spine like a old cottonwood in a windstorm. She didn't cry at the graveside. She couldn't afford to. Crying took something out of a person, and she had nothing left to give. She just stood there in the summer heat, dress soaked through, hands shaking, and made herself one single promise: she was not going to die out here. Not today. Not like this. If this story already has you hooked, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The wagon gave out 6 miles east of Redemption, Kansas, on a Tuesday in late July, when the sun was the kind of mean that made men question their choices, and women harden their jaws. Ada Prescott was 25 years old, a widow of 11 days, and completely devastatingly alone. She left the wagon where it sat, took her satchel, her late husband Eli's hunting knife, a half-empty canteen, and those 2 crumpled dollar bills she'd found tucked inside his boot after they lowered him into the ground. She didn't look back at the wagon. Looking back at things was a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked. The grass on either side of the road was bleached pale gold, bent flat by a wind that carried no relief, just more heat, more dust, more silence. Her boots were already rubbing her heels raw by the time she saw the first fence post. Barbed wire strung tight and serious. Somebody's land. Somebody with the money and the will to mark what was theirs. She followed that fence line for nearly a mile before she found the gap, 2 posts leaning inward, the wire sagging between them like it had given up. She ducked through without stopping to ask permission. The line shack sat in a dry creek bed, half hidden by a stand of dead elms. The door hung off one hinge. The roof had a hole the size of a dinner plate on the south side. But it was shade, and shade was mercy. Ada dropped her satchel on the dirt floor and sat down on the edge of a rusted cot frame. She pressed her palms against her knees. Breathed. The heat pressed in through every crack in those walls, but she was out of the direct sun for the first time in 4 hours, and that counted for something. She took stock. $2, half a canteen, 1 knife, a satchel with a change of clothes, a tin of dried beans, and a needle and thread she'd carried out of habit since she was 13 years old. No husband, no farm, no plan. She unscrewed the canteen, took 1 careful swallow, and screwed it back tight. Then she got up and started looking for water. She found it 200 yards east, a shallow creek, barely running more mud than water this time of year, but real. She filled the canteen. She washed her face and her hands. She sat on a rock at the edge of that sad little trickle of water and let herself feel it all for exactly 60 seconds. She counted. 60 seconds of grief. 60 seconds of terror. 60 seconds of the kind of loneliness that doesn't have a bottom. Then she stood up, dried her hands on her skirt, and got to work. She snared a rabbit before sundown, using a loop of wire she'd stripped off that broken fence, and a technique Eli's father had taught her years ago, back when she was still a girl who believed in futures. She made fire with a piece of flint she found in the creek bed. She cooked the rabbit over a flame no bigger than her fist, eating slowly and deliberately, making it last. That night, she lay on that rusted cot frame, with her satchel tucked under her head, and listened to the dark. Coyotes somewhere to the north, wind moving through the dead elms, the distant mechanical rhythm of a windmill. A windmill meant a working property. A working property meant people. People meant either danger or opportunity, and Ada had reached the point in her life where she couldn't afford to assume the former. She closed her eyes and made herself sleep. She smelled the horse before she saw it. It was the second morning just after first light when she went back to the creek to fill her canteen. The scent hit her on the way, something wrong, something animal and hot and sharp underneath the ordinary smell of horse. She'd grown up around horses. She knew the difference between healthy sweat and the kind of sweat that meant suffering. She pushed through a thicket of scrub brush along the creek bank and stopped. The mare was down on her side in the shallow mud at the edge of the water. a bay dark as mahogany with a white star on her forehead that was caked with dried blood. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. Her legs were cut deep cuts, the kind that came from wire, not rocks. Barbed wire. The mare had gone through a fence line somewhere, probably in a panic, probably in the dark. She was still wearing a saddle. A good saddle-tooled leather silver hardware, a brand worked into the fender that Ada couldn't quite make out from where she stood. This horse belonged to somebody. Somebody who didn't know where she was. Ada crouched down and stayed very still for a long moment, watching the mare's ribcage rise and fall. "Easy," she said softly. "I see you." "See." The horse's ear flicked toward the sound of her voice, but she didn't try to lift her head. Too exhausted. Too far gone, maybe. Ada set down her canteen and made a decision that she understood, even as she made. It was going to cost her time and energy she didn't have to spare. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The cuts on the mare's legs needed cleaning. Ada tore strips from her spare dress, the better one, the one she'd been saving, and soaked them in the creek water. She cleaned each wound carefully, talking low and steady the whole time. "You're gonna be all right," she told the horse. "I know it doesn't feel that way right now. I know you're scared and you're hurting and you want to quit. But you're not gonna quit. You hear me? Not today." The mare's breathing began to slow toward something more regular. Her ear stayed fixed on Ada's voice. Ada found plantain weed growing in a soft patch along the creek bank, common as dirt and worth its weight in gold for drawing infection. She packed it into the worst of the cuts and bound them with her torn cloth strips. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was all she had. It took most of the morning to get the mare up. Ada urged her, coaxed her, got her footing sorted out from the mud, one hoof at a time. When the horse finally stood, trembling unsteady but standing, Ada pressed her forehead against the animal's neck and closed her eyes. "There you go," she breathed. "There you go, girl." She looked at the brand on the saddle again. A clear W inside a circle. Bar W. She'd heard that name before once in a town she'd passed through with Eli. Somebody's big cattle operation. Somebody with real money and real reach. She ought to return the horse. She knew that as plainly as she knew anything. She also knew that walking into a stranger's ranch with no name, no reputation, and no husband standing beside her was the kind of thing that could go a dozen different ways, and most of them weren't good. She stood there in that summer heat, the mare leaning slightly against her shoulder, and made herself think it through. Go back to the line shack. Wait. Recover her own strength. Then what? Walk to redemption with $2 and no references and try to find work. Do what exactly? Cook wash someone else's laundry until her hands bled, or walk this horse back to whoever owned her and at least have something to offer. A good turn. A starting point. A reason for a conversation that wasn't charity. She picked up the lead she'd fashioned from a length of creek-dampened rope, looped it around the mare's neck, and started walking north. The Bar W ranch was bigger than she'd imagined. The main house was 2 stories solid and square. The kind of structure that had been built to last and had kept its promise. The barn was enormous, freshly painted, or painted within the last year anyway. Red fading only slightly in the relentless summer sun. Corrals spread wide on 3 sides. Horses moved in them. Good horses, quarter horses, mostly with the kind of collected, purposeful movement that spoke of careful breeding. There were 3 men in the near corral when Ada came through the gate leading the mare. They all stopped what they were doing and stared at her. The oldest one, heavy-set late 40s with a foreman's proprietary squint, stepped forward and put his hands on the top rail. "That's Starlight," he said flatly. "Where'd you find her?" "Creek bed about 2 miles southeast," Ada said. "She'd gone through a wire fence. She's got some cuts on her legs, cleaned and bound. She needs a few days off her feet, and the wounds need to be watched for fever." The foreman's eyes moved over her slowly, the way men looked at things they were trying to assess a value for. "Who are you?" "Ada Prescott. I've been staying in the old line shack down by the dead elms." "That's Bar W property." "I know. I didn't have anywhere else to go." One of the other men laughed short and dismissive. The third one looked away entirely, like the conversation already bored him. "You a squatter?" the foreman said. "I'm a widow," Ada said. 11 days. That landed. The foreman's expression didn't exactly soften, but it shifted slightly, the proprietary squint giving way to something more uncertain. The sound of boots on the porch steps drew everyone's attention. The man who came down from the house was taller than the foreman by half a head, with dark hair going gray at the temples and shoulders that looked like they'd been assembled for heavy use. He was somewhere around 35, Ada guessed, and he moved the way men moved when they were used to things getting out of their way. Not arrogant, purposeful. There was a difference. He saw Starlight first. His face changed a quick, unguarded flash of something that might have been relief, and then it settled back into stone. "Where was she?" he said. "Creek bed southeast," the foreman said. "This woman brought her in." The man's eyes moved to Ada. They were gray-pale and sharp, and they didn't miss a thing. "Webb Calloway," he said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an established fact. Ada Prescott. He walked forward and ran his hands down Starlight's legs, examining the bindings with slow, careful attention. His jaw was tight. She could see him working through something, assessment, gratitude, suspicion, all happening at once behind those gray eyes. "You did this," he said. "The cleaning and binding." "Yes." "Where'd you learn that?" "My father-in-law. He had horses most of his life." Calloway straightened. He looked at her steadily, and there was something in that look that was harder to read than simple evaluation. It had weight to it. History in it, maybe. The kind of look a man wore when he'd learned the hard way not to trust things that appeared suddenly and seemed on the surface to be good. "She might have died out there," he said finally. "She might have," Ada agreed. "She didn't." A long silence stretched between them. Somewhere across the yard, one of the hands had taken Starlight's lead and was walking her slowly toward the barn. The mare moved with careful, painful dignity. "You got somewhere to go," Calloway said. "Not yet." "You got any experience in ranch work beyond horses?" "I can cook. I can keep ledgers. I can do most things if someone shows me once." Another silence. He was looking at her hands now, at the torn hem of her skirt, the makeshift bindings she'd fashioned from her own clothes, the creek mud still worked into her knuckles. "Trudy could use help in the kitchen," he said. "We pay $7 a month in meals. Bunkhouse for the hands. There's a spare room in the main house that was used for storage. You can have that." It wasn't generosity. She understood that clearly. It was a business transaction offered to a woman who'd brought back something valuable by a man who calculated things carefully before he offered them. "I'll take it," she said. He nodded once and turned back toward the house. "Gable," he said to the foreman, not looking back. "Show her where things are." Gable looked at her the way a man looked at a problem that had just become his responsibility. He jerked his head toward the house. "Come on, then." Ada picked up her satchel from where she'd set it down in the dust and followed him. The main house smelled like coffee and beeswax, and something slightly scorched, the kind of smell that meant a working kitchen that never quite caught up with itself. Trudy the cook was a woman in her 50s, with forearms like a blacksmith, and a disposition that made it clear she had already decided her opinion of Ada, and would be revising it exactly never. "You cook," Trudy said, looking her over without stopping what she was doing at the stove. "Well enough," Ada said. "You clean?" "Yes." "You complain?" "Not unless I've got something worth complaining about." Trudy's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not warmth, just a slight reduction in hostility. "Room's at the end of the hall upstairs," she said. "There's a basin and a pitcher. Supper's at 6. You'll be helping with breakfast starting tomorrow 4:30. "Fine," Ada said. "And don't bother Mr. Calloway with questions. He answers what he answers and leaves the rest alone. You'll figure out which is which soon enough." I wasn't planning to bother him. "Good." Trudy turned back to her stove. "Most women who land on this property have ideas about Webb Calloway. I'm telling you now so you can rid yourself of them." Ada set her satchel down and looked at the woman's back steadily. "Mr. Calloway gave me a job because I brought back his horse," she said. "That's all there is." Trudy said nothing, but her shoulders relaxed slightly by about half an inch, and Ada counted that as a start. Her room was small and bare and magnificent. A real bed with a real mattress. A window that looked west toward the last red burn of the day's sun going down behind the flat line of the plains. A wash basin with clean water in the pitcher. Ada set her satchel on the floor. She poured water into the basin and washed her face and her hands and the back of her neck, leaning over the bowl with her eyes closed, feeling the cool against her skin. When she straightened and looked in the small mirror above the dresser, she didn't quite recognize herself. She looked older. She'd lost weight in the 11 days since Eli died, and her face had the kind of sharpness that came not from beauty, but from necessity. Her eyes were steady, though. That much was the same. "All right, Eli," she said quietly to the empty room. "I found a place to land." She pressed her palm flat against the windowsill and watched the sun go down. Outside, she could hear Webb Calloway's voice from somewhere near the barn, low-clipped, giving instructions. He didn't sound like a man who spent a lot of words on things that didn't need them. She'd known men like that. Her father had been like that. Eli had been the opposite, warm and easy and generous with his laughter, and she had loved him for it, and she had buried him in Kansas dirt, and she was not going to let that break her. She was going to be useful. She was going to earn her $7 a month and keep her head down and figure out what came next. That was all. That was enough. That was going to have to be enough. Somewhere in the barn she heard Starlight make a soft sound somewhere between a whinny and a sigh, and she found herself against everything almost smiling. "You're gonna be all right too," she said to the window, to the darkening plains, to nobody and everybody. "Just you wait." The wind moved through the summer grass outside, bending it flat, pushing it west, carrying nothing with it but heat and distance, and the particular silence of a frontier that owed no one anything and would outlast them all. Ada Prescott stood at that window until the last light was gone. Then she unpacked her satchel, folded her clothes, set Eli's hunting knife on the nightstand, within easy reach, and went to bed. Ada was up before 4:30. She didn't need anyone to wake her. Grief had cured her of deep sleep months before Eli even died, all those nights sitting beside him while the fever worked through him, watching his chest rise and fall, and praying it would keep doing both. Now her body simply refused to stay unconscious past the first gray hint of dawn. It was a kind of damage that had made itself useful. She was already at the stove when Trudy came down, coffee boiling and biscuit dough rolled out flat on the floured board. Trudy stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. "Flour's in the wrong bin," Trudy said finally. "That's the coarse grind. Biscuits'll come out like gravel." "Then show me which bin," Ada said. Trudy crossed the kitchen, moved the dough to a different bowl, added a handful of the finer flour, and worked it in with her thick fingers without another word. Ada watched and remembered. She didn't ask twice about anything. Breakfast was served at 6 to 12 ranch hands, who ate like they were in a race and spoke to Ada, when they spoke at all, in the particular tone men used with women they hadn't yet decided what to make of. She poured coffee and kept her face neutral and her ears open. Webb Calloway ate at the far end of the table, apart from the hands by some unspoken agreement of rank. He ate fast and efficiently and said nothing until he was done, when he pushed back his chair, looked down the table at no one in particular and said, "North fence needs walking today. Gable take 2 men. Then he picked up his hat from the hook by the door and was gone. One of the younger hands, boy of maybe 19, freckled and loose-jointed, looked at Ada and said, "He always liked that." "He was like that before his wife died," said one of the older men without looking up from his plate. "Worse since." The table went quiet. The young hand went back to his eggs. Ada gathered the empty plates and said nothing, but she filed it away carefully, the way she filed everything in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. Touch. She checked on Starlight that first morning, slipping into the barn between breakfast and the midday meal, while Trudy was occupied with bread. The mare was standing, weight distributed carefully to favor the worst of the cuts, but standing. Her eyes were clear. She turned her head when Ada came through the door and made a low sound in her chest. "I know," Ada said. "Still hurts. It's gonna hurt for a while yet." She unwrapped the bindings she'd put on at the creek and examined each wound in the barn's morning light. Clean. No heat, no swelling beyond what was expected. She'd gotten to them in time. She was rewrapping the last one when she heard the barn door and felt the shift in light. She didn't look up. "You're supposed to be in the kitchen," Gable said. "Trudy doesn't need me for another hour. These bindings needed changing." "That's not your horse." "No." Ada agreed, smoothing the last strip of cloth into place. "But she doesn't know that." Gable stood in the doorway for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to make something of it. He decided not to, which told her something about him, that he was the kind of man who picked his battles by how much they'd cost him, not by whether they were right. "Mr. Calloway's the one who decides what happens with his animals," he said and left. Ada patted Starlight's neck twice and went back to the kitchen. She found the ledger books on the third day. She'd been sent to the small room off the main hallway. Trudy called it the office, though it was barely bigger than a closet, to find a receipt for a feed delivery that one of the hands needed for a supplier in town. The receipt was easy enough to find. The ledgers were stacked on the shelf above it. 4 of them, their spines cracked and the entries inside written in 2 distinct hands. A careful, elegant one from several years back, and a second one more recent that was competent but hurried entries crossed out and re-entered columns that didn't quite balance. She wasn't snooping. She put her finger on the receipt and started to turn away. Then she saw the figure at the bottom of the most recent page. She stopped, looked again. Looked a third time. The numbers didn't add up. Not by a little, by a significant margin, the kind that either meant a serious arithmetic error or something worse. She stood there with the receipt in her hand and the ledger open on the desk, and thought about it for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not very long at all. She put the ledger back exactly where she'd found it, and went and delivered the receipt. But she thought about those numbers all through the midday meal and all through the afternoon. And when she was lying in her room that night, listening to the summer dark outside her window, she was still thinking about them. She had kept books for Eli's father's farm for 3 years. She knew what honest errors looked like, and she knew what other things looked like. These weren't honest errors. She didn't know yet what to do with that knowledge, but she held it carefully, the way you held something sharp that you weren't sure you were going to need. The first time Webb Calloway spoke to her at any length was on the 5th day. She was in the barn with Starlight early again before the household woke, sitting on an overturned bucket beside the mare's stall, talking to her in the low, steady murmur that she'd discovered kept the horse calm during the morning changing of her bindings. She was mid-sentence about absolutely nothing, describing the biscuit dough from the morning before, how Trudy had a particular way of folding it that she'd been trying to replicate, when she heard the soft fall of boots in the straw. She looked up. Calloway stood at the far end of the stall gate, arms resting on the top rail, watching her. He'd clearly been there for at least a minute. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but there was something in it that wasn't hostility, something quieter than that. "She likes you," he said. "She likes the sound of a voice," Ada said. "Doesn't much matter whose. It matters more than you'd think." He came into the stall slowly, the way a man came around a horse he knew well. No sudden movements, no wasted gestures. He ran his hand down Starlight's neck. The mare leaned into it. "She was my wife's horse," he said. "Catherine picked her out herself. Said she had the best eyes she'd ever seen on an animal." Ada kept her hands moving, kept working on the binding, gave him room to say the thing or not say it. "Catherine died 2 winters ago," he said. "Fever." He paused. "Starlight hasn't let anyone handle her much since. She went through the fence line 3 nights ago. I figured she was dead." "She almost was," Ada said. He looked at her then directly, the way he hadn't quite done yet in the 5 days since she'd arrived. "Why'd you do it?" he said. "Bring her back. You could have kept walking, taken the saddle. The saddle's worth more than she is on paper, Ada said. But I wasn't raised to think that way. Calloway was quiet. Outside, the first birds were starting up the particular sharp calls of a plains morning, beginning to heat itself back up. "Where are you from?" he said. "Missouri originally. Eli and I were heading to Colorado when he got sick. Took him 3 weeks to die." She said it plainly because it was a plain fact, and she'd found that the only way to carry the weight of plain facts was to set them down where they were, instead of trying to dress them up into something more bearable. "I didn't have enough money to go back, and I didn't have a reason to go forward, so I stopped." Just like that. Not just like anything, she said. Nothing about any of it was just. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded. Once the same single nod she was beginning to understand was his version of many things depending on context, and left the barn. She sat with Starlight in the quiet that followed, and tried to decide what had just happened. She couldn't quite name it. It wasn't the beginning of trust. It was too guarded for that, too careful on both sides. But it was something. A door that had been fully closed, now slightly ajar. She told herself not to read anything into it and got up to start breakfast. By the end of the first week, she had worked out the rhythms of the Bar W well enough to move through them without friction. Breakfast at 6. Morning barn work she'd claimed Starlight's care entirely now by virtue of being the first one who'd thought to do it consistently, and nobody had argued. Kitchen work through midday. Whatever Trudy needed in the afternoon. Supper at 6. It was in the in-between spaces that she did her real work. She found the second ledger discrepancy on the 9th day, and the third on the 11th. Each one larger than the last. Each one buried in the columns with just enough surface competence to escape a casual review. She said nothing. She was not yet sure she had the standing to say anything. Then she heard the name Silas Kane for the first time. It came from the bunkhouse. Two voices she'd started to be able to tell apart. The young freckled one whose name was Pete, and an older hand named Roy, who had a deliberate, measured way of speaking that made her pay attention. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was walking past with a basket of laundry. "Kane was here again yesterday," Pete was saying. "Saw him myself up on the ridge just watching." "He's been watching for weeks," Roy said. "Since Calloway turned down his offer on the water rights. Kane wanted that creek easement bad." "What happens if he can't get it legal?" Roy's pause was longer than it needed to be. "Nothing good," he said. "Silas Kane doesn't lose things legal or otherwise and just tip his hat and ride on." Ada kept walking. She set the laundry basket down inside the back door of the house and stood there with her hand flat on the wall, putting together what she'd just heard with what she'd seen in those ledger columns. Water rights. Creek easement. Numbers that didn't balance. She didn't have all the pieces yet. But the shape of something was beginning to emerge, the way a form emerged from fog, not clear, not certain, but definitely there. She was carrying the evening coffee into the hallway when she heard Gable's voice from behind the office door, low and pressed flat in a way that was trying to stay quiet and not quite managing it. "I'm telling you, it's not going to hold much longer. He's going to look at the books." A second voice, someone she didn't recognize, slightly muffled. "Then make sure there's a good enough story in those books that it doesn't matter. And if that widow starts talking, she's been in and out of that office, then handle it." The second voice was gone. She heard the sound of someone moving toward the door, and she stepped back, quickly, moved down the hall, set the coffee tray down on the kitchen table without a sound, and stood with her back against the wall, and her heart hammering against her ribs. "Handle it." Gable came down the hall. He stopped when he saw her. Something crossed his face quick and ugly before he smoothed it back. "You're up late," he said. "Coffee for Mr. Calloway," she said. "Trudy asked me to bring it." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She kept her face still, and her eyes neutral, and counted every one of those seconds. "Right," he said, and walked past her and out the back door. She breathed. She picked up the tray with hands that were almost steady and knocked on the office door. "Come in," Calloway said. He was at the desk, papers spread in front of him, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled. He looked up when she set the tray down, and something in her face must have been showing because his expression sharpened immediately. "What's wrong?" he said. She set the coffee pot down carefully. She'd been turning this moment over in her mind since the hallway, rehearsing it, discarding versions, trying to find the form of it that was direct enough to matter and careful enough not to be dismissed. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you decide whether or not to believe it, because I know I don't have much standing here, and I know how this is going to sound." He set down his pen. He leaned back. He gave her the full weight of his attention in that particular way. He had absolute stillness, absolute focus, and said, "Go ahead." "I've been in this office twice finding things I was sent to find," she said. "And I've seen your ledger books. Not because I was looking for anything, I want to be clear about that. But I've kept books before for 3 years, and I know what I'm looking at when I look at them." She paused. He said nothing. "There are entries in your most recent ledger that don't balance," she said. "Not by accident. The pattern's too consistent for accident. And 5 minutes ago in the hallway, I heard Gable talking to someone I didn't see, and he said—" She stopped, started again. "He said that if I started talking, someone needed to handle it." The silence in that room was a different kind of silence than any she'd encountered in the 2 weeks she'd been on the Bar W. It had density to it. Weight. "You're accusing my foreman," Calloway said. His voice was level. Completely level. That was the thing that frightened her just slightly, how still he went when something hit him. "I'm telling you what I saw and what I heard," Ada said. "What you do with that is your business." He looked at her for a long time. "Show me," he said. She pulled the ledger from the shelf, the most recent one, and opened it to the first page she'd noted. She set it in front of him and pointed to the column and the entry and the balancing entry that didn't balance. Then she moved to the second, then the third. He didn't speak while she showed him. He looked at each entry with that same still absolute focus, and she watched something move through his face that was harder than anger and quieter than grief. The particular expression of a man who was not surprised and hated that he wasn't surprised. "How long?" he said. Not to her specifically, to the ledger, to the room. "Based on when the entries shift character 7-8 months maybe," she said. "Around the time of the water rights dispute from what I can tell." He closed the book and sat back. "Ada." He said her name for the first time without the formality of the surname. "What I'm about to ask you to do is more than I've got the right to ask." She waited. "I need to know the full scope of this before I move on Gable," he said. "If I move too soon before I've got the whole picture, he'll cover what's left, and I won't be able to prove anything. I need someone to go through every entry in all 4 of those books and tell me exactly how much is missing and where it went." He looked at her steadily. "That's a week's work, maybe more. And it puts you in a position that's not safe if Gable figures out what you're doing." "He already suspects," Ada said. "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. The coffee was getting cold between them. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want something in return." His eyebrow moved just slightly. "I want you to listen," she said. "When I bring you what I find, I want you to believe me before you ask me to prove it twice. I've been in this house 2 weeks, and I've been looked at like a problem every single day. I'm not a problem. I'm the person who found your horse and brought her back and just handed you a reason to fire your foreman instead of letting him bleed you dry. So I want you to listen to me like what I say has value." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not the slight reduction in hostility she'd gotten from Trudy, or the cautious reevaluation she'd gotten from Pete and the other hands. Something more than that. Something that was, unless she was entirely wrong about the man, the beginning of actual respect. "Fair enough," he said. Outside, the summer dark pressed against the window. Somewhere on the ridge to the north, though neither of them could see it, Silas Kane's men were watching the lights of the Bar W burn into the night. And in the barn, Starlight stood in her stall, with her legs heeled halfway, and her eyes clear, and waited for morning. She started on the ledgers that same night. Calloway gave her a lamp, a fresh pot of coffee, and the key to the office door. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. She sat down at that desk, opened the oldest ledger to the first page, and began. She worked the way she'd learned to work as a girl, methodically, without rushing, moving through each column the way you moved through a field. You were searching, not skipping anything, not assuming you already knew where the thing was hidden. The first book was clean. Whoever had kept it before, the elegant hand, the careful entries, had done it properly with the kind of precision that came from genuine care. She moved through it in 2 hours and set it aside. The second book was where it started. Small at first amounts transposed a supplier payment that appeared twice in slightly different forms, a feed order that had been entered at one price and receipted at another, with the difference buried in a miscellaneous column. Small enough that a busy man reviewing his own books after a long day wouldn't catch it. Small enough to look like honest sloppiness. She wrote it all down on a separate sheet of paper in her own hand, column by column, discrepancy by discrepancy. She did not editorialize. She did not interpret. She simply recorded what was there and what should have been there, and the distance between the two. By the time the house was fully asleep and the lamp had burned down a third of its oil, she had a number. Not the final number. She still had 2 books to go, but enough of a number to make her chest go tight and still. Gable hadn't been stealing pocket money. He'd been systematic, deliberate. The kind of deliberate that required planning and patience, and the certainty that no one was looking closely enough to catch it. She closed the second book, pressed her palms flat on the desk, and thought about the voice she'd heard behind the office door. Not Gable's voice. The other one. The one she hadn't recognized, muffled and certain, telling Gable to handle it. She picked up her pen and kept working. She was back in the kitchen at 4:30. Trudy came in 20 minutes later, took one look at her and said, "You sleep at all?" "Some," Ada said, which was technically true if you counted the hour and a half on top of the covers with her boots still on. Trudy studied her for a moment, with those sharp, practiced eyes that didn't miss much. "You're keeping something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm keeping plenty of things," Ada said. "Most of them aren't mine to share." Another of those half-inch relaxations in Trudy's shoulders. The older woman turned to the stove and said, "Eggs are low. I'll need someone to go to the Delaney farm this afternoon." "I'll go," Ada said. "You know where it is. I'll find it." Trudy made a sound that might have been approval and handed her a pot to fill. Calloway found her in the barn that morning, same as before, though this time she wasn't talking to Starlight. She was standing at the stall gate with a piece of paper in her hand and a look on her face that made him stop walking before he reached her. "How bad?" he said. She handed him the paper. He read it. She watched his face do the thing it did when something hit him, that stillness, that absolute internal quiet that was louder than most men's shouting. "This is just the second book," she said. "I've got 2 more to go. But the pattern's clear enough now that I can project the scope of it." He looked up from the paper. "How much?" "If it holds consistent, somewhere between $900 and $1,200 over 18 months. He said nothing. "That's not the worst part," she said. He looked at her. "The timing," she said. "The larger amounts started 8 months ago, right around when Kane started pushing for the water rights easement. And there's a set of entries in the 3rd column of the November page." She leaned over and pointed to a line on the paper. "That's not a feed supplier. I checked the name against every receipt in that drawer. It doesn't exist." Calloway was very still. "You're saying Gable was feeding the money to Kane. I'm saying the money went somewhere that isn't a legitimate expense, and it started when Kane started applying pressure, and I think you should ask yourself, who benefits most from a ranch that's slowly going broke without its owner knowing why?" He stepped back, 1 step. She could see him working through it, not disbelieving her. She could tell that much, but needing the space to put it in order. "If Kane's been paying Gable to bleed the ranch," he said slowly, "and the ranch starts failing, and I can't service the water rights dispute legally." "You'd have to sell," Ada said. "Or settle for terms that give Kane what he wants. Either way." The silence between them stretched long and serious. Then Calloway folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket and said, "Finish the books. Don't let Gable know what you found. And don't go anywhere alone on this property after dark." She heard what he didn't say in that last part and didn't argue with it. "There's one more thing," she said, as he turned to leave. He stopped. "When you move on this," she said, "you're going to need more than my account books. Gable will say the numbers are mine, that I doctored them, that I'm the one who's been taking money. I'm a widow who appeared out of nowhere 2 weeks ago. He's been your foreman for 3 years. You need to think about who else can speak to what those books say before you make your move." He turned back and looked at her with that direct, pale gaze, and this time, the look had something in it that was unambiguous. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "I just don't always get to say so." Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the same territory. He left. She went back to the house, and the ledgers, and the lamp. She'd been on the Bar W for 17 days when the trouble in town found her. She'd gone to the Delaney farm for the eggs and stopped in Redemption on the way back for a spool of thread Trudy needed. The general store was the kind of place where everyone in a 30-mile radius passed through eventually, which meant it was also the kind of place where everything anyone had ever said or done or suspected was eventually processed, analyzed, and redistributed. She was at the counter when she heard her own name. 2 women near the dry goods shelf, voices low in the particular way voices went low when they wanted to be overheard. That Prescott woman, the one Webb Calloway took in. Took in is a generous way to put it. Harriet Gable says she's been in Webb's office every evening. Well, a significant pause. She's a widow. They're practical creatures. Ada picked up her thread, paid for it, and turned around. The 2 women looked at her. She looked back at both of them long enough that it cost them something and said, "Harriet Gable's husband has been stealing from the Bar W for 18 months. You might want to consider the source of your information before you repeat it." She walked out before either of them recovered enough to respond. Her hands were shaking by the time she got to the wagon. Not from fear, from fury, the clean, righteous kind that burned hot and fast and left something stronger in its place. She gripped the reins and made herself breathe slowly. She couldn't afford to be reckless. She'd planted a seed in that store deliberately, because the best way to protect herself was to make sure the truth was already in circulation before Gable could build a counter-narrative, but she needed to be smart about what came next. She drove back to the ranch with her jaw set and her mind working. Gable confronted her that evening. She was coming out of the barn when he stepped in front of her. Not touching her, not quite, but close enough that she had to stop or walk into him. "Heard you were in town today," he said. "I go where I'm needed," she said. "Heard you were talking about things that aren't your business." She looked up at him with a steadiness she was manufacturing from the inside out. Because the truth was that he was a large man with reasons to be afraid, and afraid men did unpredictable things. "I said what I said," she told him, "and I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it." His jaw went tight. "You don't know what you've stepped into." "I know exactly what I've stepped into," she said, "and I know how it ends. Men like you always think the person who sees them is the problem. They're wrong. The seeing already happened. The only question now is what comes next." He stepped closer. She didn't step back. She kept her eyes on his and her hand loose at her side, 3 inches from Eli's knife on her belt, where she'd taken to wearing it the last 3 days. "Webb Calloway doesn't know you," Gable said. "He doesn't owe you a thing. You're a nobody from nowhere, and when this shakes out, that's all you'll still be." "Maybe," she said, "but I'll be a nobody who told the truth. Can you say the same?" He stared at her. Something in him wanted to do something she could see it happening. The calculation running behind his eyes, and then something else in him thought better of it. He stepped aside. She walked past him at a steady pace and didn't look back until she was inside the house. Then she leaned against the wall in the back hallway and pressed her hand flat over her sternum and gave herself 30 seconds to shake. 30 seconds. No more. She told Calloway that night. All of it. The store, the two women, Harriet Gable's name being used as a source, the confrontation at the barn door. She told it plain and in order, the way she always told things, and she watched him absorb each piece of it with that particular focused attention she'd come to rely on. When she finished, he sat forward and laced his hands together on the desk. "He's going to move soon," Calloway said. "If he thinks you've started talking." "He knows I've started talking," she said. "That's why I did it in town and not in private. The more people who already know, the harder it is for him to make what I've found disappear." Calloway looked at her. "That was calculated." "Yes." "That was also brave or reckless depending on how you look at it." "I prefer brave," she said. "But I'll accept either." He almost smiled. She was getting better at seeing it the way his face moved fractionally in the moments when something got past his defenses. It was always brief, but it was there. "I'm going to ride to the county seat tomorrow," he said. "I need the sheriff, not Redemption's sheriff, the county. Redemption's too small and too tied to people who've got interest in how this comes out." He paused. "I'll be gone 2 days, maybe 3. She felt the shift in the room, the particular quality of a situation's center of gravity moving, leaning towards something irreversible. "And while you're gone," she said. "You're the one who knows where everything is in those books," he said. "I need you here. I need those final tallies finished and written clean, every discrepancy documented with the corresponding entry marked. Something a county sheriff can sit down with and understand in an hour." He looked at her directly. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Gable can't know I've gone to the county. Far as anyone's concerned, I'm riding to look at cattle on the East Range." "Understood." He stood. He looked at her for a moment and she thought he was going to say something else, something beyond the logistics, something that had been building at the edges of every conversation they'd had for the last week. But he just picked up his hat and said, "Lock the office when you're done each night," and walked out. She turned back to the ledgers. Outside, the night was hot and thick and windless, the kind of summer night that pressed in on all sides and made you feel the weight of what was coming. She opened the third book and started reading. He left before dawn. She heard the hoofbeats from her room and lay still until they faded. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and went to the office. She worked through that first day with a focus that narrowed everything else down to peripheral noise. Trudy brought her food at midday without being asked, set a plate beside the lamp, and left without comment. And Ada ate with one hand and kept writing with the other. Pete knocked on the door in the afternoon to ask about something for supper, and she answered and went straight back to the columns without interrupting her count. The final number, when she reached it, was worse than her projection. $1,432, 18 months. Spread across 4 books with a care and patience that spoke of someone who'd planned this from the start, not someone who'd stumbled into opportunism. This had been deliberate from day one. Gable had known exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was doing it for. She wrote the final summary on a clean sheet of paper, organized it chronologically, noted each corresponding entry, totaled each column, and signed her name at the bottom. She sat back and looked at it. $1,432. That was the kind of money that could break a ranch slowly over a year and a half, in a way that looked like bad luck and poor management rather than theft. That was the kind of money that would have eventually forced Webb Calloway into exactly the corner Silas Kane needed him in. She thought about the woman whose horse she'd found in that creek bed. About Catherine, who had picked Starlight for her eyes. About a man who'd buried his wife and kept going, kept running the Bar W, kept building something in the face of grief, and all the while someone he trusted was quietly dismantling it from the inside. She felt the anger again, but this time it was cold and clear and useful. She folded the summary, put it inside the front cover of the first ledger, and locked the office. Tug. The second night was when it fell apart. She was in the kitchen with Trudy after supper, both of them quiet, in the easy way they'd settled into over the past week, when Roy knocked on the back door and came in with his hat in his hands. and a look on his face that meant nothing good. "Gable's gone," he said. Trudy set down her dish rag. Ada went very still. "What do you mean gone?" Trudy said. "Rode out this afternoon maybe 2 hours after sundown. Took his gear, took his horse, didn't say a word to anyone." Roy looked at Ada. "His wife left yesterday morning with her sister. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now—" "He knew," Ada said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am," Roy said. "I reckon he did." She stood up from the table. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, sorting through it. Gable running meant one of 2 things. Either he'd lost his nerve and decided to cut his losses, or he'd gone to Kane to tell him the game was up and see what move they made next. The first option was survivable. The second was not. Not for the ranch, not while Calloway was still 2 days' ride from home. "Roy," she said, "how many men are here tonight on the property?" He counted in his head. 7. Minus me and Pete, 5 of the others are full hands. Bud's been with the Bar W 12 years. "Get them together," she said. "Quietly. Don't alarm anyone. I need to talk to everyone before morning." Roy looked at her, then at Trudy, then back at her. He was a man of measured words and measured trust, and she could see him weighing this woman 2.5 weeks on the property giving him instructions. "Please," she added. "I know I'm not who should be asking this, but I'm who's asking it." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll get them," he said, and went. Trudy picked up her dish rag. "You know what's coming," she said. It wasn't a question either. "I think so," Ada said. Gable took himself out of it. That means Kane has to move directly now or lose everything he planned for 18 months. She looked at Trudy steadily. "He's not going to wait for Webb to come back." Trudy wrung the rag slowly in her hands. "That man has been circling this property for months," she said. "2 of his riders pushed 3 of our horses off the South Creek pasture last spring. Webb had words with him over it. Kane smiled and offered to buy the water rights again and walked away like it was a business call. He won't be smiling now," Ada said. "He's out of foreman, and probably most of his plan and men like Kane don't absorb losses gracefully." She picked up her shawl from the chair back. "Keep the kitchen dark tonight, and lock the root cellar from the inside if things go sideways, child." Trudy said with a particular weight on the word that was not condescension, but something closer to fear and closer still to something else. Recognition maybe of a woman who'd made a hard decision and was walking toward it anyway. "Child, you be careful." "Yes, ma'am," Ada said, and went out to talk to the hands. She told them straight. All of it. The ledgers, the theft, the connection to Kane Gable's departure, what she believed was coming. She stood in the dim light of the bunkhouse with 7 men watching her and said it plain and without apology. When she finished, there was a silence. Pete spoke first. "Mr. Calloway know all this. He went to get the county sheriff," Ada said. "He'll be back in 2 days, maybe less if he rides hard. We need to make it 2 days. "You're asking us to hold this property," Roy said. "Not accusing, clarifying." "I'm asking you to help me hold it," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Bud. 12 years on the bar, W, barrel-chested and deliberate, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her with the kind of look that took a measurement. "You're sure about the money?" he said. Sure. I have $1,432 of theft documented to the entry," she said, "with dates, names, corresponding false receipts, I'm sure." Bud sat back. He looked around the bunkhouse at the other men. Something passed between them, the unspoken vote of men who'd worked the same land long enough to know what it was worth protecting. "All right," Bud said. "What do you need?" She told them. They moved without argument, without the particular brand of resistance she'd been bracing herself for, and something about that. The clean, unqualified way these men accepted the authority of a plan when the plan was good made her breathe easier than she had in days. She went back to the house. She unlocked the office. She took the ledgers out and wrapped them in oilcloth and put them in the bottom of the flour bin in the kitchen, where they would survive water and survive fire and survive anything short of the ground itself giving way. Then she went to the barn. She stood outside Starlight's stall in the thick, hot dark and listened to the mare breathe. "He'll be back," she told her. 2 days. We just need 2 days." Starlight shifted her weight. The wound on her foreleg was almost healed. Far out across the summer plains in a direction Ada couldn't see and couldn't name. Something was already moving toward them through the dark. She could feel it, the way you felt a storm before the clouds arrived. Not in any one thing, but in the pressure of everything, the particular stillness of the air, the way even the horses in the corrals had gone quiet in the last hour. She went back inside, sat down in the kitchen with Trudy's rifle across her knees, and waited for morning. It came. Quiet. Too quiet. And then, just before noon on the third day, when the heat was at its worst and the dust on the north road was barely visible through the kitchen window, Roy came through the back door at a dead run and said the 3 words she'd been dreading since the moment Gable rode away. "They're coming," he said. "Kane's men. 8 of them, maybe more, armed." Ada stood up. "Get everyone to their positions," she said. "Now." She was through the back door before Roy finished his sentence. The heat outside hit her like a wall, the particular merciless weight of a Kansas noon in July, but she moved through it without slowing, crossing the yard toward the barn, where Bud was already positioning himself near the corral gate, rifle in hand, face set with the calm of a man who'd been through bad days before and knew how to hold himself together inside them. "How far?" she said. "Roy figures 10 minutes," Bud said. "Maybe less. They're not trying to hide." That told her something. Men who rode openly in daylight 8 armed and not bothering to conceal their approach were men who'd decided past the point of subtlety. This wasn't a negotiation, and it wasn't a warning. Kane had run the numbers on what he stood to lose and decided that direct was the only card he had left. "Where's Pete?" she said. "South fence watching the back approach." "Good. Keep him there." She looked at Bud steadily. "Nobody fires first. You hear me? Nobody fires first unless they fire first. I need Kane's men to be the ones who started this." Bud gave her a long look. "You're thinking about after." "I'm thinking about the county sheriff Webb is bringing back with him," she said. "I need this to be something a lawman can sort in our favor. That only happens if we don't give Kane's people a reason to call it a mutual dispute." Bud nodded, slow and certain. "Understood." She went back to the house. Trudy was at the kitchen window, not hiding, watching the north road with her hands flat on the sill. "Root cellar," Ada said. "I'm not going to the root cellar," Trudy said without moving. "Trudy, I've been on this property longer than Gable, longer than half those hands out there, and longer than you." She turned from the window and looked at Ada with a steadiness that was its own kind of courage. "I'll stay out of the way, but I'm not hiding in a hole while someone tries to take what isn't theirs." Ada looked at her for 1 second. Then she said, "Stay back from the windows," and went to the hallway, took Eli's knife off her belt, and checked the rifle she'd been carrying since the night before. They came in through the north gate like they owned the approach, which was exactly what Kane wanted it to look like. 7 riders, not 8, she counted from the second-floor window as they crossed the yard, with the 8th man hanging back near the gate, on a gray horse watching. That one was Kane himself. She was sure of it without knowing why, the way he held himself apart, the way the others organized around him without seeming to. The lead rider pulled up in the center of the yard and looked around with the practiced ease of a man performing authority he didn't quite have. "Need to speak to whoever's in charge," he called out. Roy stepped forward from near the barn. "Mr. Calloway's on the property," he said, which was technically a lie and technically not, since this was still Calloway's property and Calloway's authority Roy was representing. "You got business with the Bar W, you stated. Our business is the water easement on the South Creek," the lead rider said. "Mr. Kane's been patient long enough. We're here to formalize an arrangement." "There's no arrangement to formalize," Roy said. Mr. Calloway's position on the water rights hasn't changed. The lead rider looked around the yard. Counting men, Ada realized. Making calculations. Be a shame, he said conversationally, if something happened to those horses in the South Corral. Fancy animals, skittish maybe. The threat was so naked, it was almost stunning in its directness. Ada felt the cold run through her, followed immediately by something else. Clarity. The same sharp, useful clarity she'd felt in the kitchen with the rifle across her knees. The same thing she'd felt in that creek bed when she'd looked at Starlight's wounds and made a decision. She came out the front door and walked into the yard. She heard Bud make a sound behind her, sharp, involuntary, the sound of a man watching someone do something he can't stop in time, but she was already moving, and there was no point in hesitating. The lead rider looked at her. The other men looked at her. From the gate, the man on the gray horse looked at her. "You're threatening horses on another man's property in front of witnesses," she said loud enough to carry to every person in that yard. "I want to make sure we're all clear on what just happened, so that when the county sheriff gets here, there's no confusion about how this conversation started." The lead rider's expression shifted, not retreating, but recalibrating. "County sheriff," he said. "He's been sent for," she said. "Should be arriving tomorrow at the latest, along with a full accounting of 18 months of fraudulent ledger entries, connecting your employer to theft from this ranch." She kept her voice level. She kept her eyes on the lead rider, and her awareness on every other person in that yard simultaneously. "That's the arrangement that's about to get formalized. Not a water easement." From the gate, the gray horse shifted. The man on it had gone very still. "Who are you?" the lead rider said. "I'm the woman who found those ledgers," she said. "And I'm the woman who documented every entry with the date and the amount and where the money went. It's all written down, signed, and stored somewhere on this property that isn't the office." She paused. "Mr. Kane can search every room in this house and he won't find it, but the county sheriff will have a copy in his hands before sundown tomorrow." The silence in that yard was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She watched the lead rider look back toward the gate, watched him read something in Kane's posture, watched him make a calculation. "We're not here for trouble," he said, and the whole quality of his voice had changed the performance of authority, deflating into something more careful and much less certain. "Then ride out," she said. "Now, while it's still a choice." Another silence. She counted her own heartbeats. 6, 7, 8. The lead rider pulled his horse around. The others followed in the particular disorganized way of men who hadn't been given a clear signal, but understood that something had shifted past the point of the plan they'd arrived with. All except the man on the gray horse. Silas Kane sat at the gate and looked at her across the length of the yard, and she looked back at him. And for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Nothing moved in all of it. Then he turned his horse and rode north and was gone. She didn't let herself feel it until she was back inside with the door shut. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, not the chair, the floor, because her legs simply made that decision without consulting the rest of her, and put her back against the wall and her hands over her face and breathed. Trudy appeared in the doorway, took one look at her, and went to the stove. She came back with a cup of coffee so hot it was still steaming and set it on the floor beside her without a word. After a minute, Ada picked it up. "Thank you," she said. "You talked them down," Trudy said. It came out sounding like something she hadn't expected and wasn't quite ready to account for. 8 armed men. 7, Ada said. Kane doesn't count himself in that number. 7 armed men. "I told them the truth," Ada said. "That's all it was. The truth stated plainly in front of people who needed to hear it." She took a sip of the coffee. Kane needed this to be quiet. He needed no one to know. The moment it was loud, the moment there were witnesses, and a sheriff coming, and a paper trail that 17 people could attest to, he had nothing. Trudy sat down across from her. Not on the floor, but on a low kitchen chair, which brought her close enough that it felt like a gesture of something Ada didn't have an exact word for. Solidarity, maybe? Or the particular intimacy that came from having stood in the same storm and come through the other side of it. You knew he'd back down, Trudy said. I hoped he'd back down, Ada said honestly. There's a difference. Roy found Gable. Not that same day, 2 days later, in a boarding house in a town 15 miles east, where the man had apparently been drinking since he arrived, and talking more than was wise. Roy sent Pete back to the ranch with the news, and followed the trail himself, along with what Ada had written about the second conversation she'd overheard through the office door. Calloway came back on the 4th day, not the 2nd or 3rd. He rode in just before supper, dusty and hard-faced, with a man beside him. She'd never seen older heavy-set, wearing a badge that caught the late afternoon light. Sheriff Alderman Weld County, with 3 deputies behind him. She was in the barn when she heard the horses. She walked out and stood in the yard and watched Calloway swing down, and she watched him read the yard. The positions of the hands, the quiet on the property, the absence of any sign of violence or damage. And she watched something in his face unclench a tension going out of his jaw that had probably been there since he'd ridden away 4 days ago. He walked toward her. You're all right, he said. We're all right, she said. All of us. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment in that way of his, full and direct, and waited with something he didn't put into words. They came, he said. Kane and 7 men, yesterday noon. His jaw went tight again. And they left, she said. I told them about the sheriff, about the ledgers, about the documentation. She paused. They decided it wasn't worth it. He stared at her. She could see him trying to reassemble what he'd been imagining on the ride back, whatever version of disaster he'd been bracing himself for, against what she was telling him, which was that it hadn't become disaster at all. You faced down Kane's men, he said. Alone. Roy and Bud were 12 feet away, she said. I wasn't alone. Ada. She looked at him. You faced down Kane's men, he said again, and this time there was nothing measured about the way he said it. It came out straight and plain and real. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. I did. Sheriff Alderman had been standing a respectful distance away, reading the exchange with the practiced patience of a man who'd learned when to wait. Now he stepped forward and touched his hat. Ma'am, you'd be the one with the ledgers. Yes, she said. I'll get them. She brought the oilcloth parcel out of the flour bin, while Trudy watched with an expression that had moved entirely past neutral into something warmer and more permanent. She laid everything out on the kitchen table, all 4 ledgers. Her handwritten summary, the separate sheets with each discrepancy marked and dated, and walked Sheriff Alderman through it the same way she'd walked Calloway through it, entry by entry. No editorializing, just the numbers and what they meant. Alderman read everything twice. He asked questions carefully, the way a man asked questions when he was building something solid enough to hold weight. You did all this yourself, he said. Yes. You have experience with bookkeeping. 3 years on a working farm in Missouri. He looked at the summary again. This is thorough work, he said, more thorough than I'd have expected. She didn't say anything to that. She'd learned a long time ago not to explain herself when the evidence was already doing it for her. Calloway was leaning against the doorframe watching. When she glanced at him, he was looking at her with that expression she'd been learning to read over the past weeks, the one that lived between distance and something warmer in the space his grief had made and his habits still defended. Alderman closed the last ledger and stood up. I'll need these, he said. Receipt will be provided. We'll be moving on Gable first. I understand there's a location for him. Roy can give you that, Ada said. And Kane. The money trail leads to him clearly, she said. Whether that's enough for an arrest is your determination. Alderman nodded. It's enough to start with, he said. He looked at Calloway. You've got a sharp witness, Webb. I know it, Calloway said. She began gathering the papers into order for Alderman to take. Her hands were steady. The summer light was coming through the window at a low golden angle. That meant the day was nearly done, and somewhere outside she could hear starlight moving in the corral, A soft, rhythmic sound, the sound of an animal that had healed enough to be impatient with confinement. It was Roy who came to the door at that moment with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that made her stop what she was doing. "Miss Ada," he said. "You'd better come see." She looked up. "Gable," Roy said. "He's here. Rode in on his own. Says he wants to talk." The kitchen went very quiet. Calloway straightened from the doorframe. Alderman set the ledger back down on the table. She looked from one to the other, read the question on both their faces, and said, "Let him in." Gable came through the back door looking like a man who'd made a decision that had cost him everything, and knew it. 3 days of drinking had taken their toll. His face was gray under the stubble, and his eyes had the hollowed-out look of someone who hadn't slept in longer than that. He stopped when he saw Alderman's badge and went still. "Mr. Gable," Alderman said, "you've saved us some travel." Gable looked past him. He looked at Ada. He stood in that kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, "I didn't know he was going to send men with guns." The silence that followed was the particular kind that asked a question without words. "Kane told me it was just money," Gable said. His voice had lost all its authority. There was nothing left in it but exhaustion and something that might have been the first edge of genuine regret. Said Calloway would take the deal, that it would never get far enough to matter. Said all he needed was the ranch in a tight enough spot to make the easement terms look reasonable. He looked at Calloway and then looked away. "I needed the money. I owed people. I told myself it wasn't hurting anybody, that the ranch could absorb it, that—" He stopped. "I knew it was wrong," he said. "I always knew it was wrong." Calloway said nothing. His face was stone. "I'll make a full statement," Gable said to Alderman. "Everything. The arrangement with Kane, the amounts, what the money was for. All of it." He set his hat on the table, a gesture that meant something, a laying down, and said, "I'm not making it worse." Alderman looked at Calloway. Calloway gave a single nod. "Then sit down," Alderman said, and pulled out a chair. She left them to it. She went out the back door into the evening air and walked to the corral fence and stood there with her arms folded on the top rail, looking at Starlight, who looked back at her from across the corral with those eyes that Catherine Calloway had picked her for, intelligent and clear and full of something that lived close to recognition. "Almost done," Ada told her. She heard the back door open and close. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Calloway came and stood beside her at the fence, close enough that their arms nearly touched. He looked at Starlight too for a long moment, and she let the quiet exist between them without trying to fill it. "You could have sent word," he said. "When Kane's men came, Roy could have ridden to find me." "I had 2 days, and no certainty you were findable," she said. "And writing for help that might not arrive in time isn't the same as having what we needed right here." Which was, she thought about it, the truth, she said, and people willing to stand behind it. He turned and looked at her. She kept her eyes on Starlight for a moment longer, then looked back at him. "I want to show you something," he said. "Tomorrow when the sheriff's finished and the paperwork's done and this place is quiet again." He paused. "There's a section of the South Creek I rode as a boy. Before any of the easement business, before any of this. Catherine loved it." He stopped, started again. "I haven't been out there in 2 years. I'd like to go. I'd like it if you came." She held his gaze. In the fading light, his face was open in a way it hadn't been when she'd arrived. Not without grief. It would never be without grief. But grief with some air in it, some room for something else to live alongside it. "All right," she said. Above them the first stars were beginning. The summer dark was coming in soft and slow, and somewhere inside the house, Silas Kane's plan was being taken apart, statement by statement, entry by entry, into something that would hold up in a court of law and stay there. Sheriff Alderman and his deputies stayed the night. Nobody slept much. The kitchen table became a kind of command post, statements, written, signed, witnessed, stacked in order. Gable talked for 3 hours without stopping. and what came out of him was worse than Ada had projected and more detailed than she'd hoped. Names, dates, amounts, the specific conversations with Kane, the specific instructions about which entries to falsify and how. He gave it all up with the exhausted thoroughness of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally, at the very end of everything, decided that setting it down was worth what it cost him. Calloway sat through most of it in the corner chair without speaking. She watched him absorb each piece of it, each new detail about what Gable had done, how long it had been running, how carefully it had been planned with that iron stillness of his. And she thought about what it cost a man like that to sit still while the full shape of a betrayal assembled itself in front of him. When Gable finished and Alderman closed his notebook and the deputies led Gable out to the yard, Calloway stood up from the corner chair. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room for a long moment, and nobody said anything because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Then he turned around. He looked at Ada. "Go get some sleep," he said. "Both of you." He included Trudy with a glance. "Tomorrow's going to be long enough." Trudy made a sound that was halfway between agreement and argument and took herself upstairs. Ada picked up the lamp from the table and paused at the doorway. "Webb," she said. He looked at her. "Gable made his choices," she said. "You didn't make them for him. This isn't on you." He held her gaze for a moment. "I should have looked at the books more carefully," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you trusted someone you'd hired to be trustworthy, and he turned out not to be. Those aren't the same thing." She left him with that and went upstairs, and for the first time in 5 days, she slept without the rifle beside her. Morning came in hot and bright and relentlessly ordinary, the way mornings did after nights that had felt like they might never end. Alderman rode out with his deputies before breakfast, Gable in tow, with a promise to return within the week once the formal charges were drawn up. He shook Calloway's hand, and then, to her mild surprise, turned and shook hers. "Your documentation was the backbone of this, ma'am," he said. "Without those ledgers organized the way you had them, we'd have been working for a month just to establish the pattern. This'll go considerably faster." He looked at her steadily. "You ever need a character reference for anything you write to my office?" She thanked him and meant it. Pete and Roy were at the corral fence when she crossed the yard, watching the deputies ride north. Pete looked younger in the morning light, unburdened in the way young people got when the tense thing was over. Roy looked the same as always, measured, quiet, permanent. "You did good," Roy said without looking away from the road. Coming from Roy, that was a speech. "We all did," she said. Pete grinned. "You walked out into that yard and talked down 7 armed men with nothing but your mouth and a piece of paper," he said. "That's something I'm going to tell people about for the rest of my life." She laughed, an actual unguarded laugh, the first one in longer than she could immediately remember. It felt strange in her chest, good strange, like something coming back online that she'd forgotten was still there. They rode south after breakfast, just the two of them. Calloway had saddled a gray mare for her gentle steady accustomed to riders of varying experience, and they went at an easy pace across the summer-bleached pasture without talking much, which she'd come to understand was his most natural state, and no longer read as distance. The South Creek was fuller than the one where she'd found Starlight properly running clear over the rocky bottom, shaded on one side by a stand of cottonwoods that had been growing there long enough to be serious about it. She understood immediately why someone would want rights to it. She also understood, sitting beside it in the dappled July heat, why someone who loved this land would refuse to give it up. Calloway dismounted and let his horse drink. She did the same. They stood on either side of the creek for a moment, then he crossed to her side and sat down on a flat rock near the bank, and she sat beside him, and for a little while neither of them said anything at all. "Catherine used to bring a book out here," he said finally. "She'd read for hours. I'd find her here some afternoons when I thought she was somewhere else entirely." He paused. "She was a reader. I never had the patience for it." "I read," Ada said, "when there were books available. Eli bought me one every time we passed through a town with a bookshop." "What kind?" "Anything. I wasn't particular. She looked at the water moving over the rocks. He was a good man, Eli. Not dramatic about it. He didn't make a show of being good. He was just steady and kind in a way that was so consistent you almost didn't notice it until it was gone. Calloway was quiet. I miss the steadiness, she said. More than anything else, just having someone who was steady. He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him, watching the creek instead, and she felt his attention as a kind of weight, not uncomfortable, but present. You're the steadiest person I've met in 2 years, he said. She turned and looked at him. I mean that plain, he said. Not as a compliment to make you feel good. As a fact I've observed. He held her gaze in that way of his, direct, and a little uncomfortable in its completeness. You've been on this property a month. In that time you brought my horse back from the dead, found a theft that would have bankrupted me inside another year, held this ranch together while I was gone, and talked down armed men without firing a single shot. And I haven't once seen you lose your footing. I lost my footing, she said. In the kitchen, after Kane's men left, I sat on the floor. That doesn't count, he said. It counts, she said. I'm not made of iron web. I was frightened. I know, he said. That's what I'm saying. You were frightened and you did it anyway. That's not the same as not being frightened. That's better. She held his gaze. Something had shifted in the quality of the air between them, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the quiet, irreversible certainty of a season turning. I don't know what I'm going to do next, she said. After whatever this resolves into, I don't have a plan past the ledgers being delivered. You have a position on this ranch, he said, for as long as you want one. That's not contingent on any of this. That was true 3 weeks ago. I know, she said. But I want to be clear about what I am here. I'm not someone who stays because she has nowhere else to go. I was that for about 4 days at the start. I'm not that anymore. What are you now? He said. She thought about it. Someone who chose to be here, she said. There's a difference. Something in his face shifted, the same fractional movement she'd learned to read, but larger this time, less controlled. There is a difference, he said. Yes. They sat beside the creek for a while longer. Her horse moved to the water's edge and drank. A hawk turned in the sky above the cottonwoods, wide and unhurried. The heat pressed down on everything equally without mercy, the way Kansas summers did, and it was fine, she thought. It was all fine. She had survived worse than heat. The formal charges against Silas Kane came 12 days later. Alderman rode out with a deputy and 2 folded documents, one for Calloway's records, one for the county file, and sat at the kitchen table drinking Trudy's coffee while he explained what the charges meant and what the process would look like going forward. Kane was charged with a conspiracy to commit fraud, financial manipulation of a private business enterprise, and trespassing with armed intent. Gable's full statement, combined with Ada's documentation, combined with the testimony of 3 of Kane's own men who'd apparently decided that their employer's fortunes no longer warranted their loyalty, had built something the county prosecutor was calling one of the tightest cases he'd seen in a decade. Kane's lawyer will fight it, Alderman said. They always do, but the evidence is the evidence, and there's a lot of it. He looked at Ada. You'll be called to testify, both of you. He nodded to include Calloway. Probably in the fall when the circuit court comes through. We'll be there, Calloway said. She noticed the we. She thought he did too. After Alderman left, Calloway came to find her in the barn. She was with Starlight where she usually was in the early afternoon, the mare now fully recovered and entirely too comfortable with being fussed over. You hear all of that? He said. Yes, she said. You all right with the testimony? I kept honest records and told the truth to the people who needed to hear it, she said. I'm not afraid of saying so in a courtroom. He leaned on the stall gate and watched her work for a moment. Alderman's office sent a formal letter of commendation, he said, for your work on the ledgers. It'll be on record. She paused, looked at him. That's... She stopped, started again. I didn't do it for a commendation. I know, he said. That's probably why you got one. She laughed, that unguarded one again, the one that felt like something returning, and he smiled. A real one this time. Not the near miss she'd been cataloging for weeks. An actual smile with his whole face in it, and she understood in that moment why Catherine Calloway had picked this man. Why she had sat beside this creek with her books and come back to this house and built a life here with him. There was something under the stone of him that was worth the work of getting past the stone. Chapter 3 days after that, Eleanor Gable came to the ranch. She arrived without announcement in a borrowed wagon, a woman of 60, with her husband's name, and none of his instincts, who had apparently spent the 2 weeks since his arrest methodically separating herself from everything he'd done, with a thoroughness that Ada could only describe as surgical. Trudy answered the door and came to find Ada with an expression that communicated several things at once. Eleanor Gable stood in the front hallway and looked at Ada with the direct evaluative gaze of a woman who was used to assessing situations quickly and had reached her conclusions before the door was fully open. "I owe you an apology," she said, "and I'll give it to you plain the way it ought to be given." Ada said nothing. She waited. "I spread talk about you in town," Eleanor said. "When you first came, I said things I knew weren't charitable, and some things I knew weren't true because my husband told me you were trouble, and I was stupid enough to take his word for it without asking why he was so convinced." She straightened. "He had reason to want you gone. I didn't know what that reason was at the time. I do now." "Yes," Ada said. "What I said in town caused people to look at you sideways for 2 weeks," Eleanor said. "Some of them are still looking at you sideways because people hold on to first impressions longer than they should. That's partly my fault, and I'm telling you so to your face because you deserve to hear it that way." Ada looked at her for a long moment. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it not warmly, not yet, but with the particular respect she gave to people who did the harder right thing when the easier wrong thing was available. "There's something else," Eleanor said. She reached into her bag and produced a folded paper. "I've been talking to some of the women in town about what you did. The Ledgers, the sheriff, what happened when Kane's men came." She held out the paper. 14 signatures. Women who wanted on record in writing that they witnessed you acting with integrity under circumstances that most people, men included, would have walked away from. Ada took the paper. She unfolded it. 14 names, neat and deliberate, with a short statement above them in a careful hand. "We, the undersigned, affirm that Ada Prescott, in the matter of the Bar W Ranch, acted with honesty, courage, and complete integrity, and that her character is known to us and found to be sound." She stood in the hallway with that paper in her hands and felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in months. Not relief, she'd felt relief when Alderman rode away with the Ledgers. Not safety, she'd felt that settling in gradually over the past 2 weeks. This was something different. This was the particular irreplaceable feeling of being seen clearly by people who had no reason to be generous and had chosen to be anyway. Her throat tightened. She kept her face steady. "Thank you," she said. "Please thank them." Eleanor nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "The 2 women in the general store," she said. "The ones you heard talking when you first went into town, they both signed." Ada looked at the paper again. "Found those names." "I know," she said. Eleanor left. Ada stood in the hallway for a moment with the paper in both hands, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket next to where she used to keep Eli's knife before she'd stopped needing to carry it. Calloway found her on the porch that evening. She was sitting in the wooden chair at the far end, watching the light go out of the sky in that slow, deliberate way it did on summer evenings in Kansas, like it was reluctant to leave, like it was making sure everything was in order before it went. He came out and sat in the other chair, and for a while they just existed beside each other in the cooling air, while the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around them. "Trudy told me about Eleanor Gable," he said. "Of course she did," Ada said. 14 signatures, he said. 14, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said at the creek," he said. "About being someone who chose to be here, about there being a difference." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "I've been thinking about what that means," he said. "Going forward." He paused. I'm not a man who says things before he's sure of them. I want you to know that about me. When I say something, it's because I've thought it through and I mean it, and I'm not going to take it back. I know, she said. I've noticed. Then I want to say—" He stopped. She heard him take a breath, slow and deliberate, the way he did things when they mattered. "I want to say that this ranch is better with you on it, and that I'm better, clearer-headed, steadier in myself since you've been here, and that I'd like you to stay. Not as kitchen help, and not as a ledger keeper, as a partner. In whatever form that takes, and at whatever pace that happens, but as someone who is here, fully, permanently." He looked at her. "If that's something you want." She turned and looked at him. In the settling dark, with the summer plains spreading wide and quiet all around them, and starlight moving in the corral behind the barn, and the first stars beginning overhead, she looked at Webb Calloway and saw what he was. All of it, the grief and the iron and the smile underneath. Both the man who'd built something real in difficult country and kept building even when someone was quietly tearing it down, who had taken a woman in from a creek bed with $2 and a dead husband and a satchel full of nothing, and given her a lamp and a key and the space to be exactly who she was. She thought of Eli. She thought of the 60 seconds she'd given herself at the creek the first day. The 60 seconds of grief and terror and bottomless loneliness. She thought of the promise she'd made to herself on a rusted cot frame in an abandoned line shack. "I am not going to die out here. Not today. Not like this." She had kept it. She had kept it every single day since, in 100 small and large ways. And now she was sitting on a porch in the July dark, and a good man was asking her to choose something instead of just surviving it. "Yes," she said. "That's something I want." He reached over and covered her hand with his, and left it there, and neither of them moved for a long time, and the night came in around them warm and full of the sounds of a working ranch that was going to be all right. In the barn, Starlight lifted her head in the dark and breathed in the evening air, healed and whole, and exactly where she was supposed to be. And Ada Prescott, who had buried her husband with $2 and a broken wagon, and a grief she thought might finish her, had found something she hadn't known she was riding toward. A place that needed her, a man who saw her clearly, and a life that was entirely, irrevocably her own.